Well, good everyone, and welcome to this special event, an interview with Penelope Curling about her memoir, 3 Earthquakes, 1 Coup d'etat, and a Handful of Revolutions, a memoir from a humanitarian psychologist. Before I introduce Penelope, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land from where I'm broadcasting this interview, the Gadabanud of the Eastern Maar Nations, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We've got an hour with Penelope tonight, and there will be time for questions at the end. So you can either write any questions in the chat box, and I will go in and ask those on your behalf, or you can raise your hand icon, and then I'll invite you to ask the question directly. But if during the interview, if you can please keep your mics on mute so we don't get background noise coming through. If your internet drops out for any reason, simply click on the link again and you'll be brought straight back into the session. And the link to this interview with your certificate of attendance and a short survey will be emailed to you within 24 hours. So with those housekeeping matters out of the way, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Penelope, who I first met in 2009 during my first consult with the UN at headquarters in New York. And at that time, Penelope was the staff counsellor for UNICEF. Penelope has more than 20 years' experience in the fields of traumatic stress, humanitarian aid work, community psychology, as well as clinical psychology and psychotherapy. After many years working as a UN staff member and in NGOs, she's currently an international consultant in the field of staff care in the international aid work sector. She provides coaching and consultations on staff welfare, facilitates training and workshops with a particular focus on traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, stress management, and resiliency building. She provides mission support to field officers and individual counselling, including post-disaster trauma interventions, as well as writing of policies and guidelines for practice. And so, Penelope, I would like to welcome you virtually down under, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Naomi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good, I'm so glad. And where are you joining us from today?
I'm currently in The Hague in the Netherlands. So it's morning for me still.
Okay. All right. Well, without any further ado, let's get on with some questions. Now, it's said that everyone has at least one book inside them. When did you become aware that there was a book inside you, and how did you experience the process of writing both the incredible stories of your career, but also some of the more personal aspects of your life?
Well, I started writing my intended audience was originally just family and friends, because it's so hard to talk about some of the experiences that I had, and also hard for people who I know and love to really understand what I was doing. You know, my mom used to always say to me, I know you've told me before, but please explain to me again what it is that you actually do. And, you know, and I understand that. So I thought, let me write down these stories for them. And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, maybe it would turn into a book and maybe I will publish it. And I wanted to put down a lot of terrible things that I'd been through, but I didn't want to make it a hard book to read or hard stories for them to read. So I also wanted to really focus on sort of the ridiculous things that that happened and the funny things that happened, and make it quite a light read. And in terms of personal details. At first, it was just a list, a series of sort of anecdotes about work experiences. But when I gave it to early readers, which included my family, they said, we're missing from the story. Your work had impact on us. So I started to incorporate sort of references to my family, and then they sort of went even further and said, it's still not enough. So I brought that in more. And other early readers also said, you grew up under apartheid. Because I'm born and raised in South Africa. And what influence did that have on your life, and how did that impact you doing the work that you did? So the story sort of grew and grew and incorporated my early years growing up in South Africa, and then describing how I ended up getting into this line of work. So it became quite personal. And yes, I'm a very private person, so it is strange that I wrote and published a memoir. But I'm happy that I did it.
I certainly can see that, sort of like, having met you and spent time with you, and you are very sort of like warm and connect with people really well. But I know that I was surprised, and other colleagues in the UN who I've talked to about your memoir were surprised at the degree of disclosures that you made, which and I have to say that I really think you got that balance perfect of the stressors that you were faced with, the ridiculous situations that you were faced with, as well as the personal impacts on you and your family.
Just to add that I don't think I could have written this book if I was still working in the UN full time. Yeah, I wrote it once I'd left the system. They do hire me back regularly, so obviously I didn't do too much damage.
So I want to talk about your work, your early work in rural mental health in South Africa, and then working for an NGO in Albania at the end of the Kosovo conflict, but around February 98 to June 1999, and that you observed in those experiences firsthand the impacts of the work with refugees on humanitarian workers. And you describe your colleagues seeming to thrive on adrenaline. They were partying hard. They were always looking toward the next sort of like troubled part of the world that they might be heading to. But under that bravado, you also noticed like a frantic nervous energy and symptoms of physical and emotional burnout. It was not being noticed or addressed by the organisations that they were working for. And this led you to develop a support group called Helping the Helpers. Can you tell us a little about this group and where it led you in your career?
Yes, when I worked in Albania in '99 it was sort of towards the end of the Kosovo crisis, where thousands and thousands of refugees had fled from Kosovo, where there was a genocide, fled into Albania seeking shelter. And it was my first humanitarian emergency. I was completely unprepared for anything. There was very little awareness of what that involved at the time. And I saw this, this frantic energy, like you said, this partying hard. Everyone was zooting around in the big cars, and it was very exciting and fun in some level. But like you say, underneath that, I saw signs of burnout. When I'd worked in South Africa, trying to set up rural mental health, community mental health services, I was wanting to train the nurses there and giving them some counseling skills. And they said, we just can't take this on. We're already overwhelmed. We're already exhausted. And they started to talk to me about, how their work was affecting them. And that was the first time that I experienced working with people with burnout. So I developed some trainings on stress management for them. And that was my very first introduction to doing sort of stress management, burnout prevention. So when I was in Albania and I recognized this, I went to the WHO offices and said, who's helping the humanitarian workers?
Hold on.
They're helping everybody else, but who's helping them? And they said to me, well, that's a novel idea. And I think, in 99, people hadn't started to really think about this. So they said, no one's doing anything. So I said, well, then I'll do it. So I started a group, which we called Help the Helpers. And we came together once a week. It was, just a very small initiative, but there was definitely a need because we were working with people who had fled massacres in their villages, people who sometimes were the only survivors in their family, and the work was very intense. So that's sort of how I rolled into this line of work. That was the very first part of it. From there, I moved to Namibia, where I was working with torture survivors. It was not a humanitarian emergency. It was not immediate trauma. It was much older trauma, much less recent trauma. But there too, I saw the impact on the people who were working with torture survivors and ex-combatants. It was 10 years after the end of the civil war in Namibia. So again, I set up a sort of fairly informal group where we could come together and talk about how the work was affecting us. And that's straight after that, I got hired by UNICEF because I'd already started this work.
Yeah. So in 2003, you were urgently requested to travel to Germany, where victims of the terrorist bombing of the Canal Hotel in Baghdad had been evacuated for urgent medical treatment. It's not the first time you recognise that the immediate aftermath of such a tragedy, it's not counselling that people need. Can you tell us what were the concerns that were uppermost in the minds of both the victims and their families?
Yeah, so, this was in 2003, my first year with the UN. Just to give a bit of background to people who are listening in, the UN offices of the UN headquarters in Baghdad were targeted and bombed, and there were many people killed and many injured. And the injured were evacuated to hospitals in Jordan, I think Egypt, I'm not sure, and then some went to Germany, to an American military base in Germany, and I was asked to go to work with them. And in 2003, psychological first aid had not yet been invented as a concept. I didn't know what I was really expected to do. I just was asked to go there, support, and I just went. And so very much tuned into what were the needs of the people, what were they wanting. And indeed, it was what turned out to become called psychological first aid. So their first needs were practical. They needed things like they'd lost their travel documents, their passports had been, in the hotel and the hotel was blown up, or they needed cash. As time passed, I remember one person saying she desperately needed a pair of tweezers, small practical things like that help people just to get back to normalcy. And there was a group of volunteers who helped with those practical things. I provided psychoeducation about the symptoms that I could see that they were experiencing, and I talked to them about things that they might experience in the future and what to do about it, how to get help if they needed it in the future. There were also many family members who had flown in to be with them, spouses, parents. So I also gave them some psychoeducation about, what it is they could expect to see and when to be concerned and what was normal and what was not normal. And then another important aspect was, which is also part of psychological first aid, is connecting them. Sorry, that's my doorbell. Connecting them with colleagues who had been in the blast. So it was about finding who was where, who was injured, who was in hospital, who had survived, who was back home. You know, this is in the days before WhatsApp, and even, I don't think it was even Facebook was around then. So it was much harder to make those connections yourselves. And finding out who, even those who had not survived, those who were killed in the blast, finding that information, sharing it with them. They really needed to know all of those things to help to sort of piece together, you know, make sense out of this senseless act. And one part of that was also helping them to physically map out what had happened, where the blast had been, where the full force of the blast, and how that affected their injuries, because those who were sort of, you know, those who, some had been in meetings and were sitting, some were facing the windows and they got, you know, a lot of glass shards in their face and in the upper body. The lower part of the body was protected by the table, for example. And if they were sitting with their back to the window, the injuries were in the back of the head. Some people had been, you know, had gone to the cafeteria. Some people had been getting coffee from a small coffee room in the corridor. So they sat down and I provided them with, managed to get big sheets of paper and marker pens, and they drew out, they physically mapped out the, you know, what they remembered of the officers and where they were sitting at the time, and where other people who had died in the blast, people who had not been injured. And that really helped. I could see that you know, they were so engaged in that, and they found that so useful to sort of physically map out what had happened and to try to make sense, like I say, out of what is otherwise a senseless act.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you talked about that, them documenting their stories, and you know, it sounds like the description of, you know, what you're you know, you're saying around that process was that it wasn't about, let's sit down with a, you know, psychologist, a therapist, and talk about what happened and, you know, whatever, but it was about them coming together as colleagues, as fellow victims, survivors. That was really sort of like the I guess the most beneficial support that they you know, that they needed at the time. In several of the missions that you went on, and other interactions with colleagues, you write that often people said that the horrors and devastations to which they were exposed to wasn't the biggest cause of distress, but conflict between colleagues, peers, and supervisors, people experiencing bullying, harassment, the bureaucracy, all the red tape, you know, in the UN, and lack of resources. And that while acknowledging that these sources of distress were very sort of like, you know, real, you also describe it as kind of like being like the top layer of distress, and that other impacts of the work lay beneath this. Can you say something about that?
I think people who work in emergencies, humanitarian emergencies, and after humanitarian disasters, they're geared up to do that kind of work, and their image of themselves is, you know, I'm an emergency responder, I'm a first responder, or I'm able to deal with all of this stuff. So when I went to talk to them, when I went to these places, they didn't talk about the big things. They didn't talk about, you know, the fact that the hardship conditions they were living in, the devastation they were witnessing, but indeed talked about much more than other people, talked about the small things, the irritations with their supervisors or with colleagues, the rules and regulations and how that hindered them from doing the things that they needed to get done. So that's what they focused on. But I could tell that those things, those fairly small irritations, which of course are real irritations and difficult things to handle at times, but I could tell that those things were much harder for them to deal with than people who are not working in emergencies. That in general, overall, the big picture was that they were struggling much more with small things than people back in headquarters locations or regional office locations were struggling with those. So my deduction is that the emergency aspect, the humanitarian aspect, is really, even though you're geared to deal with it, it saps your energy. It really drains your energy, so that the small things become that much harder to deal with. And I think there's a danger in missing that. When you'd go back to report back to headquarters or to the head of office to talk about sort of what are the main issues that people are dealing with. If you just say people are struggling because of these small little things, you really are downplaying the impact of working in humanitarian emergencies and post-disaster. You're ignoring the toll that takes on people. And I think it's very important to highlight that and to flag that. And back when I first started this work, there was little or no attention for that. And gradually over time, due to the work that I and all of my colleagues have done, that became recognized, and it's become much more institutionalized. The organizations are paying more attention to that. Yeah.
You describe your own experience of the impact of your work and the lack of supports and resources within the system in those earlier days. And of course, as a psychologist, you recognize signs and symptoms of secondary trauma, the experiencing of nightmares, hypervigilance, exhaustion, physical pain, and also drinking too much alcohol as a way of trying to sort of manage all of those stressors and symptoms. And first of all, I want to thank you for the courage of being so open in your memoir and honest about what you were experiencing, because we do need to talk about the very real impacts of working in mental health and under such extreme circumstances. I also had to smile when I was reading that section of the book at your initial resistance to seeking help, because of course we all know how to fix things, don't we? We can do it sort of like on our own. But I'm wondering if you can speak to some of those impacts that you had, and how you actually worked through them.
Yeah, I think, from my personal experience, and this is backed up by, of course, by research and literature, is that it was not so much the work itself that caused me to go towards burnout and secondary trauma, but it was what made it harder to deal with was the lack of organizational support. I talked about, before I joined the UN, I worked with torture survivors in Namibia, and I worked for a very small NGO. But before I even came on board, they had set up services for me, understanding that the work would take its toll on me, understanding that I would need support. So I had access to another psychologist who I could just contact very easily. It was all paid for, all very accessible. And I would contact her occasionally and talk through some things with her. They even had massage therapy set up that I could access, which I also made use of occasionally. So it was more the fact that they were aware of the fact that this work could take its toll on me, and they were concerned about that, and they put structures in place. Whereas within the UN, when I first joined, there was some of that awareness and there was some support, but those people moved on. There's a lot of moving around in the UN. People are moving to other jobs all the time within the system. So those people moved on, and unfortunately, people who came in their place were not just not aware, but were also not interested. When I asked for time off, it was denied. For example, I think it was in 2011, there was another attack on UN offices in Abuja in Nigeria. A car bomb drove into the offices and detonated, and there were many people killed and injured, similar to the attack of the Canal Hotel. And I was asked to go to Johannesburg to work with people who had been medically evacuated, who were injured from light injuries to very serious injuries. And to work with their families as well. And the entire process leading up from the time of the attack, working through weekends with meetings, with coordinating with colleagues who was going to go where, to going to Johannesburg, to meeting with these families and the injured people twice a day, working with, feeding back to their supervisors, to officers, coordinating with my other colleagues who were working with injured and survivors. I worked 3 weeks without a break. And in the evening, I had to catch up on my email and my everyday work as well. And I had one counselor working under my supervision, and she was also as part of the team responding. So I felt responsible for her as well, checking in on her well-being. So I was working very long hours, 3 weeks without a break, on very intense work. In the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, it has a greater impact on you than trauma that is less recent. And also understanding that, these are my colleagues as well. This was my organization that was attacked. So it also has an impact on you as well individually. And when I came back from those 3 weeks, absolutely exhausted, I said, I need a couple of days off. And they said, oh, no, it's not possible. If you're sick, you can take sick leave. I said, I'm not sick and I'm not taking sick leave. So I think that lack of support, that lack of awareness, that's what really caused my energy to just drain away, my motivation to crumble, the feeling of being used, being abused almost. So yes, I was struggling to cope, and I'm really glad you asked this question here, because I know that that probably in your audience there are other people dealing with difficult things, and it is hard to ask for help when you're the one who is in the role of a helper. But it's so important to reach out, to get support, to acknowledge, to admit. I think one of the things reasons why I didn't find it difficult to write about, for example, drinking too much alcohol, was that with my colleagues in the UN, that's a common thing. I saw many people abusing alcohol much more than me. So I always sort of thought, well, I'm not drinking that much because I don't drink as much as so-and-so. But yes, it's recognizing that your symptoms are symptoms of something which needs addressing, and that you cannot always fix it yourself, and you shouldn't always try to fix it yourself. And there's no shame in reaching out for help, as we tell our clients.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You made reference at the beginning, when you were talking about the process of writing the book, about the impacts on your family. And of course, it's very common for the people working within the UN and other humanitarian aid organisations to spend long periods apart from their families. Now, I know from your story that there were times when your family was all able to be together, but there were also long periods apart as well. Can you say something about, the impacts of your work on your family, on your relationships?
I think, most of the time, I mean, I lived with the children all the time. I was gone for the longest I was away from them was 2 weeks at a time. So in that sense, it had less of an impact on them. Of course, me coming and going did impact them and was difficult for them sometimes. But my husband was always at home with them when I was away, so they had that continuity of care. I think what impacted them more was that I would come back from these trips and they would be excited to have me home, when they were, before they were teenagers, when it was a little bit less exciting to have mommy home. And I would be exhausted, and I can remember, for example, coming back jet lagged from, I think I'd been in Asia, so there was a sort of 12-hour time difference, and my son coming in and telling me something that had happened at school, and I literally fell asleep while he was talking to me. And I remember, sort of snapping myself out of the sleep and seeing the look of the sadness on his face of just, mommy's not interested. And it's just mommy's absolutely physically exhausted. And, so that had the impact on them. And then my husband is in a similar line of work. He's worked for the UN on and off as a consultant. And so we've had long separations. He has, the longest was for a year that he worked in Mali, and I was in the Netherlands working for the International Criminal Court. And that was very difficult, especially because he was a big part of my support for me doing the work that I was doing, was be able to come home and sort of unload to him and talk to him and get his perspective on things. Of course, I couldn't share confidential things, but you have that support at home. So when he wasn't there, that made it even harder for me. But yeah, we invested, for us, the most important thing is family and relationships over and above our careers. So we always, he would be offered to renew a contract and would turn down the renewal because he knew that would go at the cost of our relationship. We would do everything we could. Whenever he had R&R, we would fly somewhere and meet somewhere and spend time together as much as we could. So really investing as much as possible in those connections and understanding that without connections, without support of some sort, you can't keep up doing this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and the strength of your relationship really comes through, in your book. I'm imagining that there will be, a lot of people working within the UN system where the toll was too great, and there would have been a lot of relationships coming to an end as a consequence of constant sort of like separations.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Definitely.
It's kind of like brings me now to what's happening currently in the UN. I mean, it's been undergoing significant restructuring and cuts to posts since at least 2019 that I'm aware of. It's now facing a dire emergency of funding and cuts. I read somewhere that there could be anything between 20 and 50,000 posts, being lost over the next 3 years, which is absolutely, a phenomenal number. The financial implications for people, the sense of identity, of who they are, feelings of betrayal, people who have worked within the system, often for decades, being sort of like very abruptly sort of like cut loose. And I'm sure that's going to, really be experienced for many people as like a moral injury. there's going to be an increase, a risk of mental health issues as a result of all the uncertainty that is happening at the moment. Have any of your past colleagues reached out to you since this sort of like newest crisis has emerged, seeking support and how they are going to reinvent themselves after a long career in the UN system?
Yes, absolutely. There's a huge crisis going on, and it's really affecting everybody, absolutely everyone, and that includes the mental health professionals like myself who used to do this work supporting colleagues. Their jobs are also on the line. So it's not just that they're supporting people who are anxious, but they're anxious themselves about what's coming and whether they will be able to continue work. So yeah, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern, a lot of insecurity. And, you know, I mean, that's the same as any organization that is undergoing a downsizing. But I think one of the differences with the UN is that it doesn't only impact the financial aspect of the family. It also impacts other, you know, the social aspect of the family. If the person has a family with them, when you move from country to country, as you do within the UN system, or as many people do within the UN system, you're moving your family with you, and you enter into a different kind of lifestyle where, you know, the children, for example, like we did, kept our children in international schools, so that even if you're moving to another country, you're staying within the same school system. And if that ends, if your contract ends, you lose the subsidies to the international schools and have to put your children back into a normal government school system, which is a whole big change for them. And I think even more, one of the bigger differences with the corporate world is that working within the UN system, your career is, for many people, is tailored to and tailored by the system itself, by the demands of the system. So you become sort of highly specialized in an area of work. You might come in with more general skills. For example, like I came in as a psychologist with a specialization in trauma, and then become highly specialized in working with humanitarian aid workers. My husband, for example, is specialized in coordinating emergencies, humanitarian emergencies in water and sanitation. And so when he's not working for the UN, there's very little demand for his skills in the Netherlands. He's out of work. So that, I think, is what makes it even more, makes the impact even greater on many of the people who are facing loss of jobs right now in the UN system. Is how do they apply the skills that they have into mainstream life?
I mean, and this is like, I don't expect you to, have an answer to this, but I'm just curious what your thoughts might be, because I mean, there are people who are suggesting that the whole UN system won't survive this, that it's going to, collapse. There will be no more UN. What are your thoughts, around that? And how do you think things might pan out over, the next few years?
I don't see that happening. I'm not informed enough. I can't really speak to that, but I think that there is a need for the UN. It was founded for a very good reason. And I think if it did collapse, everyone would be sitting around saying, what we need is something like the United Nations, and it would be reinvented. So I don't think it's going to collapse completely. I do think this, the downsizing is quite devastating. But hopefully, out of the ashes will grow a stronger UN that is more focused, that there's more appreciation for what it is that they do. You know, you sometimes only miss things when they're not there. So parts of it will fall away, yes, but there's always, I think there's always going to be a need for it, and I think it'll always be there.
I hope so. Really hope so. Just getting back now to your book, you speak about the perception of people who, you know, don't work in the UN or for other humanitarian agencies of people leading sort of like a glamorous lifestyle, jet setting around the world, staying in luxury hotels. Yet the reality for people sort of, you know, who are doing those, you know, that frontline work couldn't be further from the truth. And you describe in your memoir numerous occasions of flights on tiny aeroplanes, which I have to say would be my worst nightmare, where you feared for your safety, accommodation where electricity is intermittent, that bedding is non-existent or very suspicious in terms of staining and things. You also described situations that, you know, are really quite terrifying, of driving through streets with armed security, arriving to places with no one to meet you, in environments where it's unsafe for any traveller, let alone a female travelling alone. And one instance in Russia of being accommodated in a hotel that was functioning as a brothel. Now, none of this sounds too glamorous to me. I'm wondering if you could sort of like, you know, elaborate on some of those experiences and tell us, like, now, how did you do this for so long, being faced with these kinds of situations?
I think, you know, to be fair, there was quite a bit of the glamour and the comfort in between. You know, you were flying to an emergency, but you were flying in business class, sipping champagne, and occasionally would go to conferences and meetings where you'd stay in 5-star hotels and, you know, in cities that were very comfortable. So I think that helped to have those little moments in between. But indeed, a lot of hardship. And you know, when I first drafted this book, I gave it to a friend of mine to read, who's in publishing, to get her opinion. And I said to her, you know, I know that I'm going to have to edit it further because I keep talking about how anxious I was and how afraid I was, and I need to sort of cut that out. And she said, no, leave that in, because for most people reading this would think, you know, I couldn't do that work because I would be too afraid to do it. And it makes it much more relatable, understanding that a lot of the time I was indeed either anxious or downright terrified and just sort of getting on with the job. And a lot of hardship indeed. But, you know, the hardship is something that it's not just affecting you. You're going in there to support people who are living under these hardship conditions for weeks, for months at a time, and they're supporting people who are living under these conditions permanently. And so that really brings things into perspective. And I think it helps you to relate to people in a much more deeply when you're experiencing those things yourself and not complaining about them. And just dealing with it and getting on with it and understanding, you know, appreciating how lucky you are to be able to get back on that flight and leave and go back to your comfortable lifestyle really helps to put that into perspective. But yeah, I really enjoyed traveling, getting to places where I otherwise wouldn't have, you know, places I would not have visited otherwise. And being able to engage with people and relate to people in a way that takes you that much deeper than you would be able to do as a tourist, you know, going to visit countries on your own. So I'm very grateful for the opportunities that I had. But I must say, I'm also grateful to have gotten out when I did, because it was taking its toll. And I think it's much harder to deal with, much easier to deal with that, the hardship side and even the anxiety when you're younger. And I noticed that, you know, my energy for that decreased as I got older. So I'm glad that I was able to retire, semi-retire, earlier than working to the end of my career.
My next question about, you know, transitioning out of the UN, and you know, what were the you know, the factors in making that decision? You've just like talked about, you know, feeling like the exhaustion, or, you know, of it. Were there other factors that you considered in you know, in moving out?
Well, I had always wanted to, partly because I wasn't sure that I would, my career would continue within the UN, because you're always on short contracts, which are then renewed. So I sort of had my sights set at a certain age that, you know, I want to at least make it to that age. And then if I was not able to continue working after that, that I would have sufficient funds to be able to support myself and my husband. And what happened in the end was that my husband was offered a job, and I was working in Rome for the World Food Program. He was offered a job in Bangkok, and we felt that that distance was just too great for us to be able to, you know, do the commuting, meeting every couple of weeks. And he said to me, well, why don't you just quit your job? And my first reaction was like, I can't quit my job, you know, I'm not there yet. I'm still enjoying the work. And then immediately, you know, he said, but you always talked about early retirement. You always talked about wanting to stop work earlier. And then I reflected, and within a few minutes, I'd reached the decision that, yes, actually, that would be great. I would like to stop. And it would be wonderful to not be the breadwinner for a while. And it would be, you know, great to have an opportunity to do other things while I still have the energy to do that. So, yeah, I mean, if I was asked to give advice to other people, I would say the same thing, is try as much as possible to plan to get out of this work, whatever work you're doing, earlier, and then reassess as you go along. Is this still right for me? Do I still have the energy to keep doing it? Having that choice, if you can, if you're lucky enough to have the choice to be able to stop earlier, or even to cut down on the number of hours that you're doing, and try to find space for other things, as our energy naturally depletes as we get older. Yeah.
So I've got one last question, Penelope, before I open it up to people if they have any questions for you. Is that, could you have ever possibly imagined this roller coaster of an adventure that you know, you've been on, growing up in apartheid South Africa as your starting point, and just all the, you know, the wild, the scary, and the exciting adventures that you've had since there. You know, and is there anything with the benefit of hindsight that you would have changed?
Well, I think, you know, the short answer to could I have imagined this is no. You know, when I was young, finishing high school and thinking about career directions, this was not one of the career options which was offered to us. You know, it was a teacher, a nurse, a doctor. Being a humanitarian psychologist was not one of the career choices that was there. And I think had it been there, I would have jumped at the chance. I think it was exactly what I would have wanted to do. I originally chose journalism as my career. I started studying journalism first, partly because of what I was experiencing in South Africa under apartheid. I was, you know, full of energy and bravado and naivety, and thought that I could, you know, write about the horrors that were happening in South Africa and change the world. And very soon realized that I couldn't, reality hit of living under apartheid with its censorship laws. But I think, my dream job at that time would have been a war correspondent. I was very interested in that and would have wanted to go around to hotspots and interview people, and in a way that is sort of what my career ended up being, was going around from hotspot to hotspot, talking to people about their experiences on the ground. So yeah, I mean, I forget the second part of your question, I'm sorry.
Well, would you have changed anything?
Would I have changed anything? I wouldn't have changed the choices that I made in terms of career path, but I think I would have paid more attention to my own mental health and reached out for help earlier, and demanded more support from the organization earlier. I think by the time I was aware that I needed to speak out, I was already too burned out to be able to fight those battles effectively. Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much, Penelope. I'm now going to invite anybody who is listening in. If you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat box, or if you want to ask Penelope directly, just sort of switch on your mic and ask away. No? No questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Penelope. I just want to hold this book up. It is an absolutely fabulous read. I highly recommend it. And you will get in the email that you'll receive tomorrow with a link to the recording. Oh, I can see there's a question here, which I'll come to in a moment. The link to the recording. There'll also be a link to purchase the book if you're interested too. There's a question here. Let me just go to the chat box. The question is, what do you find most useful when dealing with vicarious trauma?
A range of things, a lot of which fall under general stress management. So, exercising, eating healthily, drinking healthily, having social support, all of those things really do make a difference. But I think with vicarious trauma, an added layer to that is, of course, the impact of the stories that you're hearing and needing to find a way to process that. So, and I think that differs for everybody. Some people, it helps to write about it. And I think for me, certainly writing this book really helped me in that way. I was aware, I had an idea of what stories I wanted to write. And I was aware as I was writing that there were certain chapters that I was really skirting around and avoiding dealing with. And then, of course, as a psychologist, you think, there must be a reason for that. And realizing that there were unprocessed experiences in that, things that were still very painful for me to deal with. And I was really avoiding getting to those chapters. So for me, writing was therapeutic. But I think also important is to talk to another. For many people, what is helpful is to talk to another mental health professional about the impact of the work on you, and helping you to process those experiences. And I think as an organization, what is important is to put those structures in place to help people. Like I said, when I was in Namibia doing the work, having someone who I could just reach out to and speak to as things started to affect me, and not waiting for it to turn into secondary trauma. Yeah.
There's another question here asking how long it actually took you to write your book.
I think in total about 2 years. And that's because I had I edited it several times and added on and, you know, gave it to people to read and waited for their responses. And then I found some of the feedback quite difficult to take because it's such a personal story, and so I had to sort of allow that to sink in a little bit first to be able to recognize that yes, maybe these people did have a point and I needed to change certain things, and so it took a lot of rewriting as well. Yeah.
Well, how did you know when it was finished?
Well, I think that's the thing, and not that I can call myself an author having only written one book, but I think is that there's never a finishing point. You know, I would finish and edit and I would be so happy with it, and I think now it's perfect, and I'd give it to people, and then when I got it back I would reread it and think, oh, this needs changing, you know, I really need to improve that. So I think probably if I hadn't actually published it and put it into, you know, released it, I'd probably still be re-editing it and changing it, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to know when to let it go.
Yes, just let it go and accept that it's never going to be perfect.
Okay, any questions before we say goodbye? Well, I think we're done, Penelope. I want to just thank you so much, both for your time this evening, your morning, and also for the book. It really is, you know, a fabulous book. Again, highly recommend it. And you know, I just wish you all the very best for future endeavours, and hope one day that our paths will cross again.
Yes, I hope so too. And thank you so much for taking the time to interview me, and thank you everybody for taking the time to listen. And I hope some aspects of my story reach you and mean something to you.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'm sure they have. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and you will, as I said, you'll receive the link with the recording and a link to Penelope's book tomorrow. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you online another time sometime soon. So bye for now, everybody. Bye, Penelope.
Bye.
Thank you.